Welcome and hello, everyone. This is your host, Hannah Zuberi, and you're watching us on Muslim Network TV with a new episode of Justice for All Now. Today, we'll be talking about manufacturing terror. What's the status quo on state surveillance and the FBI, the Muslim community, and the wider community? Our guest today is Trevor Aaronson, who's a contributing writer for the Intercept and a 2020 ASU Future Security Fellow at New America Center for Investigative Reporting, and the author of The Terror Factory: Inside FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. His 2015 TED Talk, How this FBI Strategy is Actually Creating US-Based Terrorists, has been viewed more than 1 million times and translated into more than 20 languages. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Trevor.
Of course, thanks for having me.
I've been following your work for a while and have read your book with great interest, because this is something that I've covered myself in the Muslim community as a reporter for a Muslim newspaper, as well as the editor for Muslim Matters. And we've seen how the strategy has affected our community in devastating ways, actually following up with some of the families who've been targeted, who to this day have loved ones in jail, some who have IQs of some 70 and 80, so this is something that is very, very close to my heart. And so I'm really, really grateful for your work. So tell us more about how you got involved into, when did you, you're a journalist, when did you start working specifically on the FBI?
So, pretty early in my career, I'd focused a lot on federal agencies and the use of informants. So I often did stories that were related to informants in the DEA and the ATF and the FBI. And I think it's important for everyone to realize that, there are a lot of FBI agents, or a lot of DEA agents, and there's a lot of ATF agents, and they ultimately aren't able to do their job without informants. Informants are the most critical part of federal law enforcement when it comes to doing investigations. And so, I'd always been fascinated by specifically the role that informants play, and then how informants can be, pretty difficult to handle, in the sense that, informants obviously aren't the choir boys of society. These are people who have a lot of issues themselves. And so, the FBI and these other law enforcement agencies are effectively having to manage criminals in order to catch other criminals. And so that creates a number of really fascinating questions that can be explored in journalism. And so that was my background kind of going into this research. But, it really began in earnest in, the seed of it began in 2006, when I was a reporter in Miami, and the federal prosecutors announced this case that became known popularly in the media as the Liberty City 7. These were 7 Black and Haitian American men who allegedly plotted with Al-Qaeda to bomb the Sears Tower. Of course, Al-Qaeda was never involved. These guys weren't really even Muslim. And the Al-Qaeda official was actually an FBI informant who had, years and years of kind of problematic history. And so, it was a dog of a case. I was really, shocked at the time that the media took it as seriously as it did. And I wrote about it at the time as a one-off. And then over the corresponding years, I was seeing more and more of these cases pop up around the country, where young Muslim men would be engaged in a supposed plot to attack something in the US, their only connection to Al-Qaeda or another terrorist group being the FBI informant, or sometimes the FBI undercover agent. And I thought one of the deficits of the reporting that was happening at the time was that there really wasn't any kind of systemic and holistic look at how many of these cases had happened, and of those cases, how many involved informants, and of those, how many involved actual connections to terrorists. And so the research that I did that became the substantial part of this was taking 10 years of these cases from September 11th, 2001 to September 11th or September 2011, and analyzing all of those cases and finding that out. And what we found out at the time was that, the vast majority of the 500 or so defendants who'd been caught up in terrorism prosecutions post 9/11 had actually been caught up in these sting operations in which, they didn't have actual links to terrorists. It was an informant or an undercover agent. And it wasn't even really an issue that, potentially dangerous people who otherwise were reaching out and looking for Al-Qaeda were getting caught. That wasn't the case at all. It tended to be more that, people who are mentally ill or economically desperate or otherwise easily manipulated by these informants, who in turn can make lots and lots of money when they bring in cases, were the ones that they were catching. And so to me, that became this like very kind of incredible story in the sense that, on its face, the federal government is saying we've caught hundreds and hundreds of terrorists, but in reality, that wasn't the case. And then what kind of questions that raises, such as, questions about the FBI's priorities, questions about how this inflates the perception of terrorism from within Muslim communities in the United States, and perceptions about maybe like what the FBI is missing by spending so much time focused on kind of, manufactured terrorists of sorts.
In your TED Talk, you say, and I'm getting an echo. Okay, so you say that this strategy is, so the FBI is more responsible for terrorism plots in the United States. Do you believe, and I'm sure you got pushback at that time for this. What sort of pushback did you get? And what do you say to your critics?
Yeah, so the statement I made, which I realize is provocative, but is absolutely true and is supported by the data, is that the FBI is responsible for more terrorist plots in the United States than any other organization, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, any of these groups. And the pushback from organizations like the FBI is to say, well, you're counting all of these plots that really were FBI sting operations, right? And my response is, well, that's absolutely the point, because what happens when the FBI uses these sting operations is that they hold press conferences that oftentimes make the national news, and they announce that they've caught someone in this plot with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, Shabaab, whatever group it might be. And to the average viewer or consumer of news, the perception that is left in their mind is that the FBI truly stopped a plot involving one of these terrorist groups, even though the facts are that it was the FBI pretending to be this terrorist group. And so the reason I use that line in the TED Talk is like, it's provocative, certainly, but at the same time, it's really meant to show the absurdity of kind of the security theater that the FBI establishes, which is to say, obviously terrorism from these extremist groups, whether they're right-wing groups or Islamist groups, is a real thing, right? There are, bad guys out there that want to do terrible things. No one is saying that isn't the case. But what the security theater kind of creates is this perception that there are hundreds and hundreds more that are out there, and they're catching them, right? And the truth is, and what I try to emphasize to a lot of people is that, what the FBI says is that by using these sting operations, they're finding people who would otherwise get involved in plots were it not for them getting there first, right? So that is to say that they're catching the would-be terrorists before the Al-Qaeda operative or the ISIS operative is able to provide that person with weapons or a bomb or whatever it might be. And that's like a reasonable theory. I mean, certainly it's possible, but it's important to emphasize that that's never happened. We've never had a situation where you've had like an Al-Qaeda operative like roaming Chicago or New York looking for some guy to give a bomb and move forward in a plot, right? It's just never happened. The truth is that the only people roaming Chicago and New York offering bombs to people are FBI informants. And so really they're mostly catching people who are naive, vulnerable, economically desperate, and in all likelihood wouldn't be the type of person that a real ISIS or Al-Qaeda member is likely to recruit. And at the same time, there has been a fairly substantial record of the FBI missing truly dangerous threats, right? Like Omar Mateen in the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting was not detected by the FBI. In fact, had been investigated by the FBI 3 times before the shooting, and they did not deem him a threat. Najibullah Zazi got very, very close to bombing the New York City subway, far closer than he really should have. And so I think you can, I think it's a matter of, framing this issue by really making it clear that while the FBI is wrapping these people up in terrorism sting operations, there's really little evidence to support that anybody that they would catch, or anyone that they have caught, would in fact move forward on a plot on their own. Because, to be clear, there has never been a plot where the FBI, found some guy with like tons and tons of like, ammunition and weapons and bombs in his garage, and were it not for the FBI's intervention, that person would have, killed lots and lots of people. That's not happened. In every one of these cases, this is a situation where the FBI is providing all of the weapons needed in the plot, in some cases even the idea for the plot, and then pushing these people forward and making it possible for them to get involved in a kind of terrorist plot of enormous ambition that on their own they never could have gotten involved in.
And this is an investment that they're doing. I don't know why I'm getting an echo. Usually you don't get an echo. So one of the things that as you were talking about, this is sort of like an investment, because when they do this, then they get a bigger budget. So can you explain that relationship and how that works? And how much money is being poured into this? And after we talk about that, I really want to move to some of what's happening in today's world. Is this still happening? So let's talk a little bit about the money. How much investment is being made in this?
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to kind of quick history of the FBI is that, pre 9/11, the FBI was not an organization that prioritized counterterrorism as its number one. In fact, among agents, counterterrorism pre 9/11 was kind of seen as a career dead end. It was the agents who were not ambitious or not particularly good who got shuffled over to counterterrorism. After 9/11, the FBI really changed into this organization that was simultaneously a crime-fighting organization and simultaneously a counterterrorism organization. And counterterrorism became the number one priority. The FBI's budget is $3 billion every year. Counterterrorism makes up the largest portion of that. We don't know exactly how much because they don't divide it among the various sects, but counterterrorism and counterintelligence as a unit is the largest part of the FBI's budget. And there's obviously economic or financial incentives in how the FBI does business. And part of that is the way that the FBI continued to be both a counterterrorism and a crime-fighting organization all at once. After 9/11, there was talk of splitting the agency in two, like a British-style MI5 and MI6, where one is investigating crime and the other is responsible for counterintelligence and counterterrorism. Robert Mueller, then the FBI director, pushed hard against that and retained kind of the FBI as a single unit. But what that's effectively done is create a situation where the FBI has become a counterterrorism, counterintelligence organization that ultimately measures its success through traditional law enforcement metrics, right? Like, the number of people arrested, the number of people prosecuted. And so what happens now is that, the truth is that counterterrorism, if you're disrupting plots and, trying to stop terrorism from happening, that work often isn't stuff that necessarily results in an arrest. And in many cases, it's not something you can go before a public hearing in Congress and really talk about. And so what these sting operations have really proved effective for the FBI in doing is giving them a metric that they can present to Congress to essentially justify these enormous budgets, to say hey, this year we've arrested, 20 some people involved in, plots associated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the way that the FBI presents this to Congress and the public at large is not to be, upfront and perfectly transparent about the fact that the Al-Qaeda or ISIS connection was in fact the FBI informant or agent. These plots are presented to Congress and the public as if they were real plots involving these terrorist organizations. And that creates essentially kind of a wag the dog money circle, right? Like, the FBI, Congress allocates money, the power of the purse, and they give these budgets to the FBI and allocate the largest of it to counterterrorism. And, the FBI as an organization wanting to keep its budget is not going to go before Congress and say, hey, we got $3 billion and I don't think we really need this anymore. We're not catching many terrorists. Instead, they're using these cases to kind of fuel the next year's budget. And that's what they're getting. And then, the reason at the same time, it's not like congressional representatives don't read the news and aren't, reading my articles and other journalists. But, it's hard to really press the FBI on this, because if you're a congressman who's questioning whether these are effective tactics, then you're running for election in 2 years, and your opponent's going to say, hey, you're weak on terrorism. And it just becomes a really politically unpopular thing to challenge. And that creates, not only this kind of loop where the FBI is ending up getting more and more money to do more and more of these kind of sting operations, it just creates this, perception in the public at large that terrorism from within Muslim communities is much, much greater than it really is.
So it magnifies it. So there are about, you say and other experts say, 15,000 informants nationwide monitoring the Muslim community. That's terrifying. That's like more than the amount of mosques that are. So there's probably one at every mosque. And we, within the community, we often have jokes about this, and we talk about that. Like, oh, hey, FBI, if you're listening, we're just talking about real watermelons, not, it's not a code word for anything. But beyond the jokes, this is how does that work? Like, so these informants, like you said, are a lot of times they might have visa issues or have criminal backgrounds, and they're being used as criminals catching criminals. But what have you seen in your coverage? What effect does this have on the Muslim community itself?
Yeah, so there's more than 15,000 informants in the FBI in total. Not necessarily all of them are specifically targeting or being used in Muslim communities.
Okay.
We don't have a specific breakdown, but it stands to reason that the majority of them are, given that the majority of resources are being funneled into counterterrorism. But, let's say even half of them, 7,500, were used just in Muslim communities, which is certainly plausible. It's an enormous amount of informants being, targeted into those communities. And the truth is that, despite the FBI saying that they will not send informants into mosques and other, other places where inside Muslim communities without a probable cause or predicate, meaning that they had suspicion that there was an actual crime going on, the truth is that they do that all the time. Mm-hmm. The FBI is consistently sending in Muslims to, mosques and restaurants, that are frequented by Muslims and other places, not because they are suspecting criminal behavior, but simply because they are exercising their First Amendment right to be Muslim, right? And so it's a clear rights violation, but the FBI does it all the time, and they get by with it through a loophole by using informants. So agents can't do that, but informants can, and the FBI has kind of largely used informants to do exactly that, to build case files, intelligence files on people whose only crime in the FBI's view was just being Muslim, right? And so obviously this creates a number of huge problems. I mean, one, obviously you're creating, you're designating a religious minority as worthy of investigation simply by the fact that they are a religious minority, right? The other is that I think it amplifies distrust between Muslim communities and the FBI, when I think those communities are actually the most likely to provide information that would keep those communities safe. So for example, I don't know that you necessarily need an informant going into mosque to find the guy who's like, hey, I want to blow stuff up, right? I'm pretty sure the people at the mosque would be like, hey, let's call the cops about that guy, right?
That's usually what ends up happening, is that the mosque leadership or, some uncle will hear this and be like, oh my God, this guy is crazy. Let's call up, the FBI and report it to the FBI. And then they find out, like in California, they found out that it was actually an FBI agent or an informant who was doing this. And how do you compete with paying someone $100,000 to do this to the community? Like, they're actually treated like assets. I remember there was a case in Virginia just last year where this young man who worked for the Metro Police, new convert to Islam, white guy, and he was entrapped by a man who was an Arabic and Islamic studies teacher in two major mosques, and this young man is in jail right now over a $250 GameStop card. But the way what I starkly remember about that case is when the FBI informant was brought in, he was put behind a box. Nobody could see his face. It was like they were protecting him because they wanted to use him again somewhere else. And so that is something. And so I don't, I've thought about this a lot, like how does a community protect themselves, out these people. I have never seen a picture of this man. Someone must have a picture of this person, who was supposedly teaching Islamic studies, but at the end of the day was entrapping a young new convert. So what are your thoughts on some ways that communities can protect themselves?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to point out that it is quite ridiculous that the FBI often asks for anonymity for informants in these cases, mm-hmm. and what they'll tell judges is that they need to do that to protect this guy from the actual terrorist organizations, mm-hmm. right? But the irony of this is that there are actually no terrorist organizations involved in these plots. So, like, how is it that this guy is at all at risk, of that, right? And yet, judges tend to be deferential to the Department of Justice and give them that, and so that's why we often see the identity shielded for a lot of these Muslims. Mm-hmm. And it is true, these informants are really valuable to the FBI because not only do they need to find someone who can blend into a Muslim community, who likely knows Arabic, who understands the religion, but they also, and this is probably even harder to find, it also has to be someone who's like willing to do this, right? Mm-hmm. Like kind of sociopathic enough to set people up, knowing that the end result of their work is going to be this person going to jail for 10, 12, 20, 30 years, right? And I think that's hugely problematic, and given the incentive structures that are at play. And the truth is, like, I think it is a very difficult thing for Muslims to protect themselves against, because I think it seems, in my view, to kind of run counter to kind of the open culture of mosques, right? Where you're generally welcoming anyone coming in, and at the same time then having to be guarded about every newcomer, right? And so I think what's really kind of shameful in this FBI practice is kind of that kind of wearing effect it has on kind of the local Muslim culture, in that it requires this this kind of conflict that in wanting to be open, but then also being suspicious of all newcomers. And I think in my view, the one good thing that I think is at play in a lot of this for Muslims, and kind of being on the lookout for what's happening, is that the informants tend to not be as subtle as they probably should. Oftentimes they'll they'll often like hit high points, although usually, from my experience in reading about them or listening to tapes, is they're often talking about Palestine in the hopes of like finding people who are really upset about it, and then in turn might be willing to do something. They'll often talk about propaganda, ISIS, Al Qaeda videos that they saw. And so it's usually pretty. Obviously there are non-Muslim Muslims who do that as well, but in my experience, the informants tend to be. I'm sorry, they're non-informants who do that as well. But in my experience, they are. They tend to be kind of like overzealous often, and oftentimes, like you mentioned, the California case where the informant Craig Montier got caught. Essentially, that tends to not be that unusual, and so I think that the one good thing for Muslims kind of being on the lookout is that these guys can be relatively easy to spot. What's happening now, though, and there has been this shift over the last decade. It used to be that the FBI would send in informants into mosques, and they still do. But what we're seeing now is that the FBI is mainly targeting people based on online behavior. So instead of looking for the loudmouth at the mosque who's saying various incendiary things, they're looking on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram for people who are kind of sharing stuff that the FBI views as extreme, or kind of more explicitly kind of supporting terrorist organizations in posts, and then they'll kind of target them that way.
True. Now, so one of the things that you talk about, the national security theater, and but we haven't really seen many of these cases that as in media as we used to see them 4 or 5 years ago. And obviously some of that is the overshadowing of the White House theater. Everybody's too busy with what's happening in DC, and how that affects the world, and how that affects the country. But have the cases reduced, or is it because the media coverage isn't there anymore, or has the status quo changed?
So it's definitely a little both, as far as like the number of cases has reduced slightly, and the media isn't covering them as much. We after kind of the lull between March of last year, when ISIS was defeated at its final kind of physical territory in Syria, and to about like a month ago, there weren't a lot of cases. There were some, and then in general, the Trump administration, DOJ, has not prosecuted these quite as frequently as the Obama administration. And there's a number of theories as to why that's possible. Obviously, I don't think it's for any reason that the Trump administration is any more sympathetic or empathetic to Muslim communities, right? Obviously, that's not the case. But at the same time, I think there have been a couple things. I think one, we've seen a general kind of decline in and changing going on within these Islamist extremist groups. I mean, ISIS is kind of quick rise and then kind of even more rapid decline. I think during that rise, we saw tons and tons of ISIS cases in the U.S., mostly sting operations, and then during the rapid fall, we began to see very few of them. And so I think because of that, there was less of an attraction for people interested in that ideology. But that said, from 2014, at the beginning of ISIS's kind of more global rise to global attention to, up until a year ago, we were seeing a pretty steady clip of ISIS cases, not so much people who were like going over there and fighting, although that did occur, but really people who were like, kind of loudmouths and a little naive. And, they would talk to an FBI informant and say, like, I really want to, travel to Syria and join ISIS. And then the FBI informant would give them money for a plane ticket, and then they'd be arrested at the airport as they're about to fly to Istanbul or something like that, right? And that was a pretty common. I think we've prosecuted a little over 100 ISIS cases so far in federal courts. The vast majority of them were cases like that, where people were kind of caught at the airport going somewhere. And so I think those types of cases, which was the standard fare for how the feds were mostly prosecuting ISIS defendants, didn't get as much immediate attention because it's not quite as like startling as a plot to blow something up, right? Because the truth was that like at that moment in our history, the people who were interested in that ideology tended to be more interested in joining ISIS overseas than with getting involved in bomb plots here. Although I don't mean to suggest that there weren't bomb plots there. There were several, and those got a fair amount of attention. But with the vast majority were these people that were ultimately wanting to travel there. And so I think that, plus the fact that, you have an FBI that is like suddenly post 2016, much more obsessed with counterintelligence and risks from Russia, China, North Korea, and elsewhere. Not that they hadn't been involved in that, but that became a stronger priority post 2016. And the other is just, Donald Trump sucks the air out of the room, right? And so like there's this, most of the media is like, chasing the shiniest object that Donald Trump has thrown out, right? And so there isn't a lot of coverage of these issues for that reason as well.
But things are still happening, right? Maybe the target has changed, perhaps. You write in an article on the Intercept about a private right-wing group, the Northern California State Militia, which conducted military-style tactical training. And they were also, the same tactics were used on them. You write, I guess you interviewed him, and he said, I was just a human recording machine paid by the government to go into people's lives and befriend them and find out what they were thinking.
Right. So what we've seen, we're seeing more and more the FBI apply these types of tactics that it had refined in Muslim communities over the last 2 decades, in other communities as well. And so, the one we're seeing now, not at the same levels that we've been seeing cases involving Muslims, but certainly at a higher level than we've seen in the past are the use of informants and sting operations in right-wing or domestic, among the right-wing and domestic extremists. And so, in that particular case, that was an informant I had interviewed who was a former military sniper and had been recruited because of his military training to go into these militia groups. And what he found was that the FBI didn't have any reason to target these people other than that they were suspicious of them for being in a militia group. And, I know like sometimes when you use the term militia group, it sounds kind of, frightening, and you think of this kind of small army, and there are a bunch of guys with guns doing training. But like what he had described is a lot of these events that they would go to were just kind of family events where, people were having barbecues and they had their guns slung over their shoulders. I mean, to me, it's weird, but at the same time, it's nothing that's illegal and nothing that, should justify having an informant, come at you like they did. And so we're seeing more and more cases like that. I mean, the most recent is this case that was announced last week where a group of guys in Michigan were allegedly plotting to kidnap Governor Whitmer in Michigan. And, in that particular case, although those guys had, some terrible ideology and obviously had a pretty horrific plan to kidnap a governor who, had kind of taken the ire of Donald Trump over the last few months. At the same time, like they were infiltrated the entire time by informants. There were several informants that were in the group. Their main plot was to blow up this bridge that would have prevented the police from responding to a kidnap attempt at Governor Whitmer's vacation home. And that group didn't have any bombing material. It was the FBI informant who was going to provide that. And so, I think one of the things that's been kind of alarming to me has been that people that I know who have been critical of these cases that have targeted Muslims are seemingly supportive of this case involving the right-wing extremists in Michigan. And I think that's really alarming in the sense that I think, I don't support what these guys were doing in Michigan, just as I don't support what a lot of these Muslim guys were doing or allegedly doing in these plots. But at the same time, I think the problem is really the use of these tactics rather than kind of the defendants themselves. And I think, if you're going to criticize the tactics in targeting Muslims, you have to also criticize those same tactics when they're applied against people whose ideology you may not agree with, such as these right-wing extremists.
And that is, and obviously that comes with the fact that, yes, a bunch of Muslim guys out there with guns at a family barbecue would be seen suspicious in a second. But you're perfectly right that the strategy is what is wrong. And a lot of times, just as this gives you insight into how people look at events as well. Like, unless you're really following this on a day-to-day basis, majority of the public does not know that the Michigan case had an informant in it, right? And in the same way, this is the same sort of, once that becomes public, then the case you start peeling it apart. And this is exactly what the larger public also needs to know, that regardless of these cases, once they're being reported, keep an eye out for the fact that they may be an informant. Like, what the first reports come out are not always going to be accurate, and you'll find out that there's much more to the story as you peel the layers. I really want to also ask you about the Boogaloo Boys. What is, this is a new trend of, you've written about it. Can you tell us more about it and how the FBI is monitoring them, and are the same tactics being used against them as well?
Yeah, so I mean, there's some dispute as to whether the Boogaloo movement, or the Boogaloo Boys, as they're often calling themselves, are an ideology or kind of a meme. But generally, it's this kind of ideology that formed online on Reddit and websites like 8chan, where essentially these are people whose primary kind of ideology, and it's important to say you can't really generalize the Boogaloo movement, because it's kind of a loose kind of collection of ideologies or beliefs, but generally speaking, it's fair to kind of summarize to say that most of these people are kind of obsessed with the Second Amendment and fear the government takeover of the government kind of taking their guns, and that they view the civil unrest that we've seen over the summer following George Floyd's killing by a police officer in Minneapolis. They see that not just as civil unrest, but as like a prelude to a coming civil war. And there's a large portion, or a seemingly large portion, the Boogaloo movement or Boogaloo Boys that are also white supremacists. And of that group, they believe that this civil unrest is kind of the prelude to a coming race war where, white people are going to be taking up arms against minorities. What we've seen more recently during this civil unrest is that you have armed people showing up at these demonstrations, identifying themselves by wearing Hawaiian shirts is usually the way they identify themselves. And they had seemingly not been that much of a concern until more recently. There have been a couple of cases. There was a police officer killed in California by an adherent of the Boogaloo movement. And then more recently, in a case that I wrote about in the Intercept, there were two young men who were caught in an FBI sting in Minneapolis. And the ridiculous part of it is that the FBI informant actually posed as a member of Hamas and said that, wanted to recruit these guys. And these guys basically allegedly offered themselves up as mercenaries for Hamas if Hamas would give them money. They apparently were trying to raise money for, to buy land to have like a training camp for the Boogaloo. And under the supposed plot, these men provided materials to the reported Hamas member that would have modified a gun to go from semi-automatic fire to automatic fire. I mean, the ridiculous thing is, like, I don't think Hamas needs any help getting guns, but at the same time, these guys fell for it, and so they provided these weapon parts to them, and then amazingly, then they were charged with providing material support to Hamas. Right? This seemingly right-wing white supremacist ideology is then linked to Hamas. And what was amusing about it, and I say amusing in a very dark way, is that, I ended up talking to a Hamas official who condemned this and was like, no, A, we're not even interested in getting involved in plots in the U.S., which is certainly the history of Hamas. But B, that even if we were, we're not going to associate with white supremacists and right-wing extremists. And so, what was kind of remarkable about that particular case was, the FBI and all of these sting operations makes the case that they are preventing real terrorist organizations from getting involved in plots by getting there first, preventing, engaging these people. And then this was the first time that, a group like Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization by the State Department, was then saying, like, look, that's not us. We wouldn't do that. And so, it's kind of, to me, it's kind of remarkable in showing just how idiotic these two Boogaloo Boy guys were, in the sense that they really thought this was Hamas, and B, that, kind of how overzealous the government is here in manufacturing a plot that the group that they were supposedly pretending to be is now saying, no, that's ridiculous. We wouldn't do that.
So since you wrote the book, what have you been doing since then? Tell us more about, you've been writing for the Intercept, but what else takes up your time now?
Yeah. So when I wrote the book going on 10 years ago now, it came out in 2013. I never expected to kind of continue in this way. I mean, I never expected to still be writing about the FBI, but the truth was I kept coming back to this topic. And so largely for the Intercept of the last, I think I've been working with them for about 7 years now. My focus has really been on this intersection between national security and civil liberties, because so many of the policies that we saw at play and the practices we see at play in the post 9/11 FBI are really being directed at everyday people, right? Like, we're seeing more and more the use of FISA surveillance. That became a big talking point as a result of the Trump investigation and Carter Page. But there have been real questions about how the FBI has used FISA in other cases, and including drug cases. There's also questions of how the FBI has been using kind of informants in general. And so, to me, in many ways, we've kind of brought the war home, right? Like, we enacted all of these policies, some of which were very draconian, and we gave law enforcement all of these powers, because at the time we were very scared and we were afraid of another attack, and we thought we needed to do this to stop another attack. And now that we've got 20 years of distance from 9/11, it's not like these the government and these law enforcement agencies are saying like, okay, thanks everyone, we don't need these powers anymore, right? Instead, they're finding ways to justify these powers and use them in new and kind of disturbing ways. And I think, I think that's really kind of the continuing story, or the kind of longer narrative that I'm trying to report on, is how they're using these powers and how ultimately they are affecting everyday citizens. I'm disappointed I'm right about this, but when I was doing initial talks about my book, and 7 years ago, and this was one of my talking points, which was to say, like, look, this is affecting Muslims now, but it's quite likely in the future it's not just going to be Muslims, right? It's going to be used against other people, and I think that's where we are at the moment.
Yes, we definitely were the canary in the coal mine, and we keep, and this is something, and it doesn't give you any pleasure in saying that, if people had paid more attention. And even now, for example, in this article, you interviewed Mike German, who's from the Brennan Center, and something that he said really rings true to me, is that because the focus is on these vulnerable people who may have mental health issues, who may have other grievances against the government, the larger movement is not focused. The white supremacist violence that is happening is not in focus. So I'd like to get your comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we've seen a number of instances where there's been violence, as Mike German is saying, violence at these demonstrations and protests among right-wing groups that really wasn't being prosecuted, right? Like, these are not necessarily terrorist incidents, but things that local police could take on. And I think instead the FBI is going for these kind of fantastical things. And I think the worry for me, and I think this is probably shared by other critics as well, is that by spending so much time and effort on cases whose likelihood of resulting in real harm is quite low, right? Like finding people who are vulnerable or desperate and wrapping them up in plots. What are you missing among the true dangers by focusing so much on these very questionable cases? And I think that's at the moment we are now, right? Like, you can make a pretty persuasive case that over the last 20 years, as the FBI was focusing on these sting operations of questionable substance, they were missing real threats, right? Like they missed Omar Mateen in Orlando. They missed a number of substantial, and dangerous terrorist plots, and they weren't catching those, right? So by focusing on these questionable sting operations involving right-wing people, what are they missing from the right-wing threat as well? And I also think in general, like, I'm not suggesting that there isn't, potential violence among right-wing extremists, just as there's potential violence among any extremists, right, including Islamist extremists, right? But I think in general, like, the FBI is good at whipping up fear. I mean, I think there are, I am concerned about like the rise of kind of the extreme right and the potential violence it has. But I think at the same time, I think these groups tend to be loudmouths as well, and these types of tactics by law enforcement, these sting operations, really potentially exaggerate the threat of that violence. And the effect that it has, though, is that it ends up getting people to say, like, protect me, FBI, protect me, right? And that in turn fuels more and more budgets. And I think the FBI really, probably needs to take a more holistic look at what the real threats are, and not focus so much on these sting operations that, tend to kind of exaggerate the threats that we're seeing.
By the way, according to Daniel Plight, I'm an Islamist. That's FYI. So, yeah. So, with this new, with these mass protests across the country and surveillance of protesters, what are some of your concerns in that regard? As you navigate the national security scene, and this is something that is, and especially as we're getting closer and closer to the election, what are you expecting?
I mean, one of the concerning things for me more recently has been seeing that law enforcement was cloning people's SIM cards to get access to their text messages. I think, it is troubling to me to see local law enforcement engaged in that type of surveillance. And I think it is important for people to begin to realize, if they don't already, that, surveillance and mass surveillance that we're seeing is not just happening on the federal level among the FBI or the DEA. This is also happening at the local level, where local police departments are getting stingray devices and other devices that allow them to intercept communications, from your cell phone, not because they had any probable cause or any reason to think that you were doing harm, but just because you went to a protest, right? Asserting your First Amendment privilege just as much as a Muslim going to a mosque does, and we're seeing that same type of targeting, and I think that's really concerning, and I think generally the public should be pushing back on that more, and I wish they would. As far as what's going to happen in the future, I think, like a lot of people with the election, with a lot of people, I've just been really concerned about the spread of disinformation. I think that we're living in this world increasingly where half the society believes in truth and fact, and the other half thinks that's like a malleable and changeable thing just by saying something out loud, and I think that's really concerning. I think I worry about the future of law and order society when we kind of have to argue so much about whether the sky is blue every day, and so I think we're at this really kind of fragile time in our democracy. I think what we're seeing is that a lot of institutions have failed us. I think the issues that I write about for the FBI are not singular to the FBI or the only problem at the FBI. I think they are just, they are really symptomatic of a larger systemic failure that we've seen at the FBI and in other government agencies. And I think, if anything, I think whether Trump is reelected or not, I think the just utter chaos that we've had as a government is kind of really a good reason to kind of stand back and kind of reassess our values and reassess, these government agencies and what they're doing and whether we've lost faith in them. Because I don't think, for all of Donald Trump's, terrible policies and problems, I think he isn't the cancer so much as the kind of, the rot that has existed as a result of kind of larger issues within our society. I think, just as one example, and I'll make this brief. When Trump was, running in 2016 and was running on very Islamophobic candidacy and talking about stopping immigration from Muslim countries, he didn't invent that narrative, right? Like, he very much tapped into this narrative that these FBI stings that helped to establish, right? That Muslims are dangerous. Dozens of Muslims are arrested every year for terrorism. And so I think, if we're identifying problems in our society as Donald Trump, and I think there are reasons to think that he is a problem in our society, I also think that we need to understand that, like, a lot of the problems that we have are still going to exist if he's gone.
In fact, many activists that I speak to are scared that under a democratic government, if the government changes after elections, some of these issues get swept under the rug. Because you have maybe you might have a more outwardly friendlier government to the Muslim community. These issues aren't brought up as much from within the community, because right now everybody's joined together against the Muslim ban. So even those who may not, even within the Muslim community, activists who may not be pushing under a democratic government are pushing right now. But once that changes, the impetus to push won't be there anymore. And these strategies and these policies keep pushing. So this is something that definitely a lot of people are saying, that it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican government or a Democratic government, these policies need to change from within government agencies. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Please, everybody, go out and buy the book. I know it's been out for a while, but it's a fascinating read, especially, and follow Trevor's work. You can buy this on Amazon, Terror Factory Manufacturing, and you can follow his work on the Intercept. Where else can we find you, Trevor?
I'm on Twitter as Trevor Aaronson.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here. And as we leave, I just wanted to remind everybody that we are keeping, the Disney petition is over, but we do have several bills that are in Congress that we'd love for you guys to push out. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, as well as the new genocide Declaration Act by Senators Cardin, Markey, Markey is out, and please call up your senators and push for those bills. Thank you so much to all of you. Do join us on Saturday for helping tomorrow's Muslims today. October 17th is the webathon. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us and for being a part of Muslim Network TV, the only American Muslim-focused TV network. We broadcast in the US, in Canada, and Mexico, and globally through social media. Watch us on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and on Galaxy 19. Assalamu alaikum.